I remember the taste of iron in my mouth the morning my life ended. Not blood, though that would come later, but the metallic tang of fear that coated my tongue and never truly left, even now. 17 years after that first impossible moment when I made a wooden cup slide across our kitchen table without touching it. I was 13 years old. The cup moved 6 inches. My mother saw. My father saw. My younger brother Cale was still asleep in the loft above. That 6-inch movement might as well have been 6 miles for the distance it put between me and the life I'd known before. The smell of our farmhouse that morning remains burned into my memory with the clarity of a brand pressed into flesh. Wood smoke from the cooking fire, still burning low from the night before. The earthy, almost sweet scent of the root vegetables my mother had been preparing for the morning meal. The smell of my own sweat, cold and sour with the realization of what I'd just done. My father stood frozen, his work-roughened hands gripping the back of his chair so tightly the knuckles had gone white as bone. My mother made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, and the wooden spoon she'd been holding clattered to the floor. "Mikhail," my father said, and his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Not anger, not even disappointment. Terror. Pure, absolute terror. Agathon was a feudal world in the truest sense, governed by lords who answered to a planetary governor who in turn answered to the administratum of the god emperor's Imperium. We worked the land with tools our great-grandfathers had used, lived in homes built from timber and stone, and knew that somewhere far above us in the black vault of heaven, ships the size of mountains traveled between stars. We knew this because the priests told us. We knew this because every 7 years the black ships came. The black ships. Even the name carried weight on Agathon. They came to collect the tithe. Not grain, not metals, not even men for the Imperial Guard. They came for witches, for Psykers. For those cursed souls whose minds had opened doorways to places that shouldn't exist, whose thoughts could twist reality, whose very existence threatened to crack the shell of the material world and let horrors pour through. The priests called it the soul tithe. The common folk called it the witch-taking. My father, in the privacy of our home when he thought I wasn't listening, had once called it the emperor's cruelty. I hadn't understood then. I was 8 years old, watching from the window as the tithe hunters, local militia armored in boiled leather and carrying pikes blessed by the priests, dragged old Marin's daughter Elisa from her home. She was 16. She'd been able to hear thoughts, they said, had predicted when cattle would sicken, had known when storms would come. Useful things, helpful things. It didn't matter. The witch marks had appeared on her skin, strange symbols that seemed to writhe if you looked too long, and someone had reported her to the Baron's men. The tithe hunters had come at dawn. I remembered the sound of her mother's screaming. I remembered how Elisa hadn't fought, hadn't struggled, had simply walked with her head down as they took her to the Baron's fortress to await the black ships. I remembered asking my father why they were taking her if she could help people. He placed his hand on my head, fingers heavy with grief I didn't yet comprehend, and said, "Because the Emperor protects us from what she might become." 5 years later, I was the witch. The manifestation of psychic powers almost always occurred during puberty, the priests said during their sermons. The changes in the body, the flooding of new sensations and emotions, somehow weakened the barriers between a person's mind and the warp, that roiling dimension of madness and nightmare that existed behind reality, like an infection beneath skin. Most people never felt it. Most people's minds were closed fortresses, impenetrable and safe. But some, 1 in a million, perhaps 1 in 10 million, the numbers varied depending on which priest was speaking. Some had minds that opened, and through those openings power flowed, and daemons could follow. My father guided me to my chair with trembling hands. My mother picked up the wooden cup, held it, set it back down on the table as if establishing its solidity. The morning light coming through our single window seemed too bright, too harsh. Outside, I could hear our neighbor's rooster crowing. Life continuing as it always had, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding in our small kitchen. "Did anyone else see?" my father asked. His voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might alert unseen watchers. I shook my head. My throat had closed. I couldn't speak. "Are you certain?" My mother now kneeling beside my chair, her hands gripping my arms. Her fingers dug into my flesh, hard enough to bruise. "Mikhail, are you certain?" "Just me," I managed. "It just happened. I didn't mean to." I was thinking about the cup, and then it just... My father's hand came down on the table. Not quite a strike, but close. The sound made us all flinch. "Don't," he said. "Don't ever say you just did something. Don't ever admit it like that. Do you understand me, boy?" I nodded, tears burning my eyes. "Mikhail could have bunked the table," my mother said. Her voice had taken on a strange, rehearsed quality, as if she was practicing a story. "He reached for the cup and his elbow hit the table. That's what happened. That's what we saw." "Yes," my father agreed immediately. "That's what happened. An accident. Clumsy boy, half asleep, bumped the table." They were constructing a lie with the efficiency of farmers repairing a fence before winter. Necessary work. Survival work. "But what if it happens again?" I asked. The question that would define the next 7 years of my life. "What if I can't control it?" My father crouched down until his eyes were level with mine. He had hard eyes, my father, weathered by 38 years of labor under Agathon's harsh sun. But in that moment, they held a gentleness that hurt more than any anger could have. "Then you learn to control it," he said. "You learn or you die. Those are the only choices the Imperium gives people like you." The next days passed in a fog of terror so thick I could barely breathe through it. My father continued his work in the fields. My mother continued preparing meals and tending our small vegetable garden. My brother Cale, 9 years old and mercifully oblivious, continued playing with wooden swords and annoying me with questions about when I would teach him to track deer in the forest. Everything continued. Everything was normal, except that I was a witch, and every moment I existed was a threat to everyone I loved. My father began my education in secret that very night. We told Cale and my mother that I was learning advanced farming techniques, the kind of knowledge that would pass from father to eldest son. In a way, it was true. Just not the kind of farming anyone spoke of openly. "The mind is like soil," my father told me, lighting a single candle in our small storage shed behind the house. We sat on sacks of seed grain, speaking in whispers. "It can grow what you plant, or it can grow weeds. What you have, this curse, it's a weed, a powerful, dangerous weed. You can't dig it out. The roots go too deep. But you can starve it. You can refuse to water it. I don't understand. Don't use it," he said simply. "Not ever. Not even to test if you still can. The moment you use it deliberately, you feed it. It grows stronger. You become more obvious to things that hunt your kind. The tithe hunters. Worse than them, boy. There are things in the warp." He caught himself, made the sign of the Aquila across his chest. The Emperor protects. But yes, things that can sense Psykers. Things that want to use you, possess you, turn you into a doorway for themselves. The less you use your power, the less they can smell you. I learned later that my father had no formal training in any of this. He was a farmer born and raised on Agathon, educated only enough to read the Emperor's catechisms and keep basic accounts. But he'd seen witches taken. He'd heard the sermons. He'd listened to the warnings. And he'd spent 5 years since watching Elisa dragged away, dreading that one of his own children might manifest. Now his dread had become reality, and he did the only thing a father could do. He tried to save me. "Never let your emotions spike," he continued. "Strong feelings, rage, terror, joy, they're like throwing oil on coals. Your power feeds on them. You need to stay calm, always." even when you want to scream. How? My voice cracked. I was 13. Puberty was a storm of emotions I couldn't predict, let alone control. How am I supposed to stay calm when— "You learn," he interrupted, and his voice was iron. "You learn, or you die, or worse, you die and take everyone you love with you. Those are the options, Mikhail. Choose." I chose to learn. The Emperor protects, they said in the sermons, every seventh day. But I was learning that for some of his children, protection looked a lot like abandonment. And faith looked a lot like hiding in the dark and praying no one ever looked too closely at the monster you were trying not to become. The first year was the hardest. My body betrayed me constantly. Floods of adolescent emotion that I had to suppress, sudden flares of anger or fear that made the air around me feel charged. Moments when I could feel something pressing against the inside of my skull, like a prisoner testing bars. My father watched me constantly, his eyes sharp for any sign of slip. My mother developed deep lines around her mouth from the permanent half-smile she wore in public, the mask of a woman whose family had nothing to hide. Cale noticed nothing. At 9 years old, he was blessedly self-absorbed, more concerned with whether he'd be allowed to attend the harvest festival than with his older brother's strange new tendency to go silent in the middle of conversations. I envied him that innocence, even as I resented it. He could afford to be oblivious. I had to be vigilant every waking moment. The witch marks never appeared on my skin, which my father said was a mercy. Not all Psykers developed them. It seemed to correlate with how often they used their powers, how deeply they drew from the warp. Since I never used mine deliberately, never reached for that place inside myself where I could feel power coiling like a serpent, my skin remained unmarked. Just another farmer's son, sun-browned and work-roughened, distinguishable from any other boy my age, only by the haunted look that sometimes crept into my eyes when I thought no one was watching. But I could still feel it. The power. It sat in the back of my mind like a pressure behind my eyes. A constant awareness of potential. I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that if I wanted to, I could make objects move, could sense emotions from people nearby, could perhaps do things I hadn't even imagined yet. The temptation to test it, just once, just to understand what I was capable of, was immense. I never did. My father's words had sunk into me like fishhooks. You feed it, it grows. It grows. They find you. They find you. Everyone dies. By the time I was 15, I'd developed a reputation in our village as a serious boy, perhaps a bit slow, certainly lacking in humor. People attributed it to the natural solemnity of an eldest son who understood the weight of future responsibilities. In truth, I was simply exhausted. The constant vigilance required to keep my emotions dampened, to never let surprise or anger or even joy spike too high, had worn grooves into my psyche. I moved through life in a perpetual state of muted existence, afraid to feel too much of anything. The tithe hunters came to our region twice during those years. Both times, they took someone. The first was a boy named Corvin from a farm 3 miles north of ours. He was 12. His parents had tried to hide him when the fever dreams started, when he began speaking in languages no one on Agathon had ever heard. The witch marks appeared across his back like angry red tattoos, symbols that hurt to look at directly. Someone, no one ever admitted who, reported the family to the Baron. The tithe hunters came at night. They took Corvin. They executed his parents for harboring a witch in contravention of imperial law. I watched from the crowd as they burned the bodies in the village square. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the incense the priests used to purify the area. My father's hand rested on my shoulder, grip tight enough to hurt. A message. This is what happens. Never forget. The second was a girl. No, a young woman, named Sarah. She was 17, engaged to be married to the blacksmith's apprentice. She'd hidden her abilities for years, my father said, had been careful, had done everything right. But something happened during a festival celebration. Too much emotion, Too much joy, the barriers in her mind slipping just for a moment, and she'd accidentally set fire to a decorative banner with nothing but a thought. 12 people saw it happen. There was no hiding after that. The tithe hunters were more efficient with her. She was valuable, they said. Young, strong, powers still developing. The black ships would find use for her. They took her within the hour of the incident. I remembered seeing her being loaded onto the wagon, wrists bound with iron manacles inscribed with prayers. She'd looked directly at me as they drove her past our farm. Our eyes met for perhaps 3 seconds. She knew. Somehow, she knew what I was. And in her eyes, I saw not condemnation, but pity. A witch recognizing a fellow witch, sharing a moment of understanding before she was taken to a fate I could barely imagine. That night, I vomited until my stomach was empty and my throat burned. My father found me behind the barn, held my shoulders while I shook. She saw me, I managed between heaves. She knew. "Sarah won't tell," my father said with grim certainty. What purpose would it serve? She's already caught. Condemning you wouldn't save her. How do you know? Because spite requires hope, he answered. And anyone the tithe hunters take has none left. The years accumulated like sediment. 16, 17, 18. My brother Cale grew into a strapping young man, strong-backed and good-natured, beloved by everyone in the village. He began courting the miller's daughter. My parents began discussing when they might expect grandchildren. Life flowed forward for everyone except me, frozen in my private hell of constant suppression. I became skilled at it, at least. The emotional dampening that had once required constant conscious effort became second nature. I could attend festivals without feeling joy, could watch fights without feeling anger, could see suffering without feeling compassion beyond a distant, intellectual acknowledgement that suffering was occurring. Some part of me was dying, I realized. Some essential human component was being starved to death in service of survival. But I survived. That counted for something. My father aged rapidly during those years. The stress of living with the secret wore on him visibly. His hair went from dark brown to iron gray. Deep lines carved themselves into his face. He developed a cough that never quite went away. My mother told me privately that he sometimes woke screaming from nightmares, dreams of the tithe hunters coming for me, of the family burning in the village square, of failing to protect his son from the curse the emperor had seen fit to inflict. He blames himself, my mother said, during one of our rare private conversations. We were washing clothes at the stream, far enough from the house that we could speak freely. For your condition, as if something he did caused it. Nothing caused it, I said, scrubbing a work shirt against the rocks with mechanical efficiency. It just happened. I know that. You know that. Your father knows that too, in his rational mind. But he's a father. Rationality only goes so far. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw what the years had done. She'd been beautiful once, my mother. Village boys had composed clumsy poems about her before she'd chosen my father. Now, at 42, she looked 60. The constant fear had carved her beauty away, leaving behind a woman who smiled because social situations demanded it, but whose eyes never quite matched the expression. "I'm sorry," I said. The words felt inadequate, meaningless. "I'm sorry for what this has done to you, to Father, to all of us." She stopped washing, her hands stilling in the cold water. When she spoke, her voice carried a ferocity I'd rarely heard. "You apologize for nothing, Mikhail. Nothing. You didn't choose this. You don't deserve this. If I could cut that curse out of you with my own hands, I would. Since I can't, we hide it. We protect you. That's what family does. Even if protecting me destroys you, especially then. I was 20 when everything changed, not with a catastrophe, but with a whimper. The high, terrified whimper of my sister. Sister, I should explain. Cale hadn't been the only addition to our family in those years. When I was 16, my mother had given birth to a daughter, Liana. An unexpected blessing, my father had called her. Though I'd seen the fear in his eyes even then, another child meant another chance for the curse to manifest, another soul to hide or lose. Liana was bright and curious and effortlessly charming in ways I'd never managed even before the power had awakened in me. She had my mother's beauty and my father's steady temperament and Kale's easy friendliness. Everyone loved Liana. She was normal in ways I'd forgotten how to be. She was also a Psyker. The manifestation happened during the Harvest Festival, the same festival where Sarah had been caught years before. Liana was 12 years old, spinning in circles with the other children, laughing with pure, uncomplicated joy. And then one of the boys, the tanner's son, known for his cruel humor, grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises, said something cruel about our family being cursed with ugly children. Liana had looked at him, really looked at him, and the boy's nose had simply broken. No hand touched him. No one hit him. His nose crunched sideways as if struck by an invisible fist, blood sheeting down his face, and he'd screamed like a branded animal. The crowd had gone silent, that horrible, heavy silence of people witnessing something that violated natural law. And Liana, sweet, innocent Liana, had looked down at her own hands in dawning horror, understanding what she'd done and what it meant. I'd been standing 15 feet away, drinking weak beer and trying to mimic the jovial atmosphere I didn't feel. The moment Liana's power manifested, I'd felt it, a spike of psychic energy that hit my dampened senses like a hammer blow. Our eyes met across the crowd. Hers were wide with terror. Mine, I'm certain, reflected the same emotion. My father reached her first. He scooped her up in his arms as if she'd simply fallen, as if nothing supernatural had occurred, and loudly declared that she'd been playing too rough, that the tanner's boy must have taken an elbow to the face in the crowd of spinning children, that these things happened during festivals. His voice was hearty, jovial, edged with the slight slur of a man who'd had too much to drink. No one believed him. I could see it in their faces, but my father was a respected man, a hard worker, a loyal servant of the emperor. And more importantly, what he was suggesting was vastly more comfortable to believe than the alternative. People wanted to accept the explanation, wanted to avoid the implications of what they'd actually witnessed. So they did, or at least, most of them did. The tanner's son recovered. His nose healed crooked, giving him a permanent sneer that actually suited his personality. His father demanded compensation. Not because he believed Liana was a witch, he claimed, but because our clumsy daughter had damaged his son. My father paid double what was asked. The price of continued silence was never quite spoken aloud, but both men understood it, and Liana joined me in the private hell of the hidden Psyker. She was better at concealing it than I'd been initially. Maybe because she'd seen the horror in everyone's eyes immediately, had understood from the first moment of manifestation that this was something to be feared and hidden. Or maybe she'd watched me for years, observed my careful emotional dampening without understanding why, and now recognized it for what it was, survival technique. My father and I trained her together. I taught her what my father had taught me. Never use it, never feed it, never let emotions spike. Suppress, suppress, suppress. My father taught her the same lies we'd practiced. The cover stories, the misdirections, the art of seeming normal when normal was the furthest thing from what you were. She cried sometimes, late at night when she thought no one could hear. I heard. I lay in my bed in the loft and listened to my 12-year-old sister weep for the childhood that had been stolen from her, for the future of marriage and children and normalcy that had evaporated the moment her gift had awakened. I wanted to comfort her, but what comfort could I offer? I was 20 years old, had been hiding for 7 years, and the best I'd accomplished was surviving. Not living. Surviving. Kale noticed the change in family dynamics, but, true to form, misinterpreted it. He thought Liana was becoming sullen and moody due to adolescence. He thought I'd grown more protective of her because I was finally taking my role as eldest brother seriously. He thought our parents' increased anxiety was related to the failing harvest that year, the drought that had withered crops across the region. He never suspected. Cale was a good man, honest and straightforward, and those very qualities meant he couldn't conceive of the deception happening in his own family. We kept him ignorant deliberately. The fewer people who knew, the safer Liana and I were. Even family, especially family, could be dangerous with knowledge like ours. 2 years passed. Liana and I existed in a strange partnership, 2 prisoners in adjacent cells who could see each other but never quite touch. We rarely spoke about our shared condition directly. What was there to say? But there was an understanding between us, a recognition that needed no words. She was 14. I was 22. Life continued its grinding forward motion. Cale married the miller's daughter in a ceremony that was genuinely joyful. My parents aged further. I took on more of the farm work as my father's cough worsened. Liana helped my mother with household tasks and pretended she was nothing more than a quiet, studious girl whose main interests were weaving and herb gardens. The black ships came. They arrived in orbit during the spring planting, their vast, dark shapes visible even from the surface as they blocked out sections of the starfield. The Baron's messengers rode through every village, announcing that the soul tithe would be collected in 3 weeks. All suspected witches were to be brought to the fortress for evaluation. Any family found harboring an undeclared psyker would face execution. The announcement was routine. It happened every 7 years. Like clockwork. The vast machinery of the Imperium ground forward, indifferent to individual suffering, collecting its due in human souls. But this time felt different. Maybe because Liana was at the age when most psykers manifested. Maybe because the last collection had been particularly thorough, the tithe hunters unusually zealous. Maybe because I'd spent 9 years hiding and the accumulated strain had worn my nerve to breaking. Whatever the reason, I knew, with that same inexplicable certainty I'd felt when my power first awakened, that this collection would be different, worse, final. The tithe hunters began their work 2 weeks before the black ships planned landing. They went door to door, observing children and young adults, looking for telltale signs. They questioned neighbors. They investigated anyone who'd been reported for suspicious behavior. They operated on a simple principle. Better to take 10 innocents than risk missing 1 actual witch. They came to our farm on a morning that smelled of rain. 5 men wearing boiled leather armor blessed with prayers, carrying pikes with iron tips that had been dipped in sanctified oil. Their leader was a man named Dracon, who I'd known peripherally my whole life. He'd been 2 years ahead of me at the village school, before he'd been recruited into the Baron's militia. He'd always been a cruel boy, and power had refined that cruelty into something harder and more purposeful. Imperial tithe assessment, Dracon announced as we gathered in our front yard. All family members present themselves for inspection. My father stepped forward, making the sign of the Aquila. My family is loyal to the Emperor. We have nothing to hide. Then, you'll have no objection to the inspection. Dracon's eyes swept over us. My father, my mother, Cale, me, Liana. They lingered on Liana and me. These 2. How old? 22 and 14, my father answered. Both loyal servants of, I'll determine loyalty. Dracon dismounted his horse with practiced ease. He walked directly to Liana, and I felt my entire body tense. Next to me, Liana had gone completely still, her face carefully blank. You, girl. Look at me. Liana raised her eyes. I saw her hands trembling at her sides, saw her fighting to keep her breathing steady. Fear was an emotion. Emotions fed the power. The power attracted attention. It was a vicious cycle, and Dracon was deliberately triggering it. Strange girl, Dracon commented, walking a slow circle around her. Quiet. Keeps to herself, they say in the village. Not normal for a girl her age. She's studious, my mother interjected. Helps with the household. A good daughter. I'm speaking to the girl. Dracon completed his circle, standing close enough that Liana would have to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Any strange dreams? Any moments where things happened around you that you couldn't explain? No, sir, Liana whispered. Speak up. No, sir. Louder now, but with a crack in her voice that could have been fear, or could have been the beginning of something worse. I felt it then. The pressure building behind Liana's eyes, the power responding to her terror, coiling tighter and tighter like a spring being compressed. She was going to snap. The stress was too much, and if she broke here, in front of the Tithe Hunters, we all died. She's telling the truth, I said, and Dracon's attention swiveled to me. I deliberately made my voice slightly aggressive, drawing his focus away from Liana and onto me. A misdirection. A gamble. Search the house if you want. Question the neighbors. We're just farmers. We follow the Emperor's law. Dracon studied me with eyes that had seen too many interrogations. You're the eldest son. Michael, isn't it? Yes. Strange boy too, from what I hear. Quiet. Serious. Not much for celebration or friendship. I take my responsibilities seriously. Or you're hiding something. He stepped closer. Close enough that I could smell the leather of his armor, the oil on his pike, the sweat of a man who'd ridden hard that morning. Strip off your shirt. Both arms. Checking for witch marks. Standard procedure. I complied, pulling off my rough-spun work shirt and standing bare-chested in the spring morning air. Dracon examined both arms, turned me to check my back, looked for any sign of the telltale symbols that marked active psykers. He found nothing. Years of non-use had kept my skin clear. The girl, same. She's 14, my mother protested. You can't. I can do whatever the Emperor's law permits, Dracon interrupted. And it permits this. Strip. Arms only. Liana looked at my father. He nodded, his face carved from stone. She removed her overdress, stood in her undershift, and extended both arms. I watched Dracon examine them with clinical efficiency. No marks, no symbols, nothing to justify taking her. But his eyes held suspicion. The kind of suspicion that didn't require proof, just inclination and authority. Something's wrong in this family, he said finally. I feel it. Can't prove it, but I feel it. Your feelings aren't evidence, my father said quietly. No, Dracon agreed. But they're enough to mark you for observation. The Baron will hear of my suspicions. Expect more visits before the black ships leave. They departed, leaving a wake of threat and implication. The moment they were out of sight, Liana collapsed. Not physically, she remained standing, but something inside her gave way. She began shaking, tears streaming down her face, the careful control she'd maintained shattering. I almost broke, she gasped between sobs. I could feel it building. I almost used it. But you didn't, I told her, gripping her shoulders. You held. That's what matters. They'll come back, my father said, and his voice carried the weight of a man pronouncing his own death sentence. Dracon marked us. They'll watch. They'll wait for a slip. And eventually, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. That night, my family gathered around the kitchen table where, 9 years earlier, I'd moved a cup and changed all our fates. The fire in the hearth burned low. Shadows filled the corners. My father looked at each of us in turn before speaking. There's a choice we need to make, he said. All of us together. What choice? Kale asked. He was the only one who didn't already know. The only one who still believed in simple solutions to complex problems. Whether the family runs or hides, whether we take Mikhail and Liana far from here, into the deep forests where the Tithe Hunters rarely go, or whether we stay and try to maintain the deception until the black ships leave. Why would we run? Kale looked genuinely confused. We haven't done anything wrong." The silence that followed his statement was profound. "Kale," my mother began, then stopped. "How do you tell your son that his siblings are the very thing your world teaches you to fear most? How do you explain that your family has been living a lie for nearly a decade?" "I'm a psyker," I said flatly. "Have been since I was 13. Liana manifested 2 years ago at the festival. That's why everything's been strange. That's what we've been hiding." Kale stared at me, looked at Liana, back to me. Understanding and horror dawned across his face in equal measure. No, you can't be. I would have known. I would have seen something. "We hid it," Liana said softly. "We had to." "So all this time you've been..." Kale stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Do you understand what would happen if anyone found out? They'd execute all of us. Mother, father, me, everyone connected to you." "The Emperor's law is cruel," my father interrupted. "Unjust. Horrifying. Yes, we understand. We've lived with that understanding for years, while you remained ignorant." Which was deliberate, because knowledge is danger. Kale looked like he'd been struck. "You should have told me, and risked you inadvertently revealing it. Risked you making a choice we couldn't take back." My father shook his head. "We protected you the only way we could, with ignorance." "So what now?" Kale's voice had gone cold. "What are you asking me?" "To help us decide," my mother said. "Running means abandoning everything, our home, our land, our lives. It means living as fugitives in the wilderness, always one step ahead of the tithe hunters, always one slip from capture. And it means you coming with us, because if you stay, they'll torture you for information about where we've gone." "And staying?" Kale asked. "Means gambling that Dracon's suspicions aren't enough. That we can maintain the deception for 3 more weeks, until the black ships leave. That neither Mikhail nor Liana slips under the increased scrutiny." "Those are terrible options," Kale said. "Yes," my father agreed. "Welcome to the reality we've inhabited for 9 years." The conversation continued for hours, circling the same impossible choice. Run and live as hunted animals, potentially for years. Stay and risk everything on the slim hope that we could continue fooling people who were actively looking for reasons to condemn us. In the end, we decided to stay, not because it was the smart choice. It probably wasn't. But because running would have meant admitting defeat. Would have meant Draken was right to suspect us. Would have meant the Imperium's cruelty had successfully flushed out another family of witches. We chose defiance. Quiet, desperate defiance. The next 3 weeks were the longest of my life. Dracon's promised increased scrutiny manifested as constant visits, sometimes official inspections, sometimes just tithe hunters riding past our farm at odd hours, watching, always watching. Liana and I maintained our careful control. Never let emotions spike, never let the pressure build. Exist as muted, dampened shadows of human beings. The village gossip network activated. People whispered. Some defended us. The family had been loyal for generations. This was persecution without evidence. Others condemned us. Where there's smoke, there's fire, and Draken wouldn't suspect without cause. We felt the community fracturing around us, some people avoiding us entirely while others made exaggerated shows of support that felt more like spectacle than solidarity. Liana stopped eating. The stress had killed her appetite, and my mother had to practically force-feed her to maintain appearances. I developed a twitch in my left eye, a constant flutter that I couldn't control. My father's cough worsened until he was bringing up blood-flecked phlegm. Kale walked through it all in a daze, still processing the revelation that his family wasn't what he'd believed, that his entire life had been built on a foundation of necessary lies. The black ships landed on schedule, their massive forms settling into the designated landing fields near the Baron's fortress. From our farm we could see the smoke from their engines, black plumes rising into the spring sky. Every psyker that had been collected across the region would be herded onto those ships, taken into holds that, according to whispered stories, were essentially prisons, transported to Terra for assessment. Most would die. Some would be given mercy. A quick execution after evaluation deemed them too weak or unstable. Others would be fed to the Golden Throne, their psychic essence consumed to maintain the Emperor's eternal vigil. A very few, the strongest, most stable, would be sanctioned, have their powers bound and controlled, and be returned to service in the Imperium's vast psychic network. None would ever see home again. The collection day arrived. The Baron ordered all families with children between ages 10 and 25 to gather at the fortress. It wasn't technically mandatory. The law stated only that suspected psykers must be presented, but refusing to appear would itself be grounds for suspicion. We went, all of us, joined the procession of hundreds of families trudging toward their own potential destruction. The fortress courtyard had been transformed into an assessment center. Adepts from the black ships, tech priests and psychic evaluators whose exact rank and title I didn't know, had set up stations with arcane equipment. Each young person would pass through a series of tests. Basic ones first, examining for witch marks, questioning about strange incidents, psychological evaluation, then more complex assessments for those who showed potential signs. Exposure to psychically charged artifacts, proximity to sanctioned psykers who might detect unsanctioned ones, even direct psychic probing for those under deepest suspicion. My family joined the line, hundreds of people shuffling forward toward judgment. I recognized faces from across the region. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, all brought their children. All prayed those children would be found clean. Ahead of us, I watched a boy, couldn't have been more than 11, fail the first assessment. Witch marks on his ribs, his mother screamed. His father tried to intervene. The tithe hunters subdued them both with brutal efficiency. The boy was marked with an iron collar that designated him for collection and led to a separate holding area. His parents were taken away for interrogation. Standard procedure. The line moved forward. Liana gripped my hand so tightly my fingers went numb. I could feel her trembling. Could feel the power building inside her, responding to her terror. She was going to break. Right here, in front of hundreds of witnesses, she was going to manifest and condemn us all. Liana, I whispered, look at me. She turned her face toward mine. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated with fear, and I saw she was on the absolute edge of control. Remember what Father taught us, I said quietly. The soil. Don't water the weeds. Let everything go numb. Feel nothing. I can't. You can. You have to. I squeezed her hand. I've been doing this for 9 years. You can do it for 9 more minutes. Just get through the assessment. Then we're safe. It was a lie. Even if we passed today, we'd never be truly safe. But sometimes, lies were the only kindness available. The line moved forward. We were perhaps 20 people from the front now. I could see the assessment station clearly, a table with various devices I didn't recognize, a robed adept making notes, a sanctioned psyker sitting off to the side, with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at people. That psyker was the real danger. Tech could be fooled. Visual examinations could miss things, but another psyker, properly trained, might sense what Liana and I were even through our careful suppression. 15 people ahead. 10. My father turned back to look at us. No matter what happens, he said, know that everything I did was because I love you. It sounded like goodbye. 5 people ahead. 3. And then Liana made a sound, a tiny, choked whimper, and I felt the surge. Power flaring, barriers crumbling, control breaking. She was manifesting right here, right now, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Except there was one thing. I reached for my own power, the thing I'd spent 9 years suppressing, never touching, keeping locked away, and I pulled. Drew Liana's flaring psychic energy into myself, absorbed it, channeled it through my own suppressed abilities, and dispersed it safely. It wasn't elegant. It probably violated 100 principles of proper psychic discipline I'd never been taught. But it worked. Liana gasped as the pressure released. The building manifestation diffused. Her control snapped back into place, fragile but functional. And the sanctioned psyker at the assessment station turned his head directly toward me. Our eyes met across 30 feet of crowded courtyard. His were milky white, blind in the traditional sense, but seeing in ways I couldn't comprehend. He'd felt what I'd just done, had sensed the psychic energy I'd deliberately manipulated, had marked me as surely as if I'd grown witch marks across my entire face. He stood, began walking toward our family. The crowd parted around him instinctively, people recognizing the authority of his robes and his obvious difference. "That one," the psyker said, raising one hand to point directly at me. "Bring him forward." The tithe hunters reached me before I could process what was happening. Iron-strong hands gripped my arms, pulling me out of line. I heard my mother scream, heard my father shouting something about rights and proper procedure, heard Kale's voice raised in protest. All of it seemed distant, happening to someone else, in another world. The sanctioned psyker stood before me. Up close, I could see he was younger than I'd initially thought, perhaps 30. His skin had the pale, waxy quality of someone who spent too much time away from natural sunlight. The psychic assessment had revealed his nature early, probably before puberty, and he'd been taken, trained, sanctioned, returned to service. He was what Liana and I might have become if we'd been caught earlier. He was also what we'd feared becoming. "Kneel," one of the tithe hunters commanded, pressing down on my shoulders. I knelt. The courtyard stones were hard and cold against my knees. The sanctioned psyker circled me slowly, exactly as Dracone had circled Liana weeks earlier. But this was different. Dracone had been looking with physical eyes for physical signs. This psyker was looking with senses I could feel brushing against my mind, like fingers testing the edges of a sealed door. "You're suppressed," he said. His voice was surprisingly gentle, almost regretful. "Very deeply suppressed. Years of practice, if I'm sensing correctly. You learned young to hide what you are. There was no point in denying it." "Yes." "Who taught you?" "Taught myself." Trial and error. Remarkable. Most unsanctioned psykers lack the discipline. They use their powers recklessly, draw attention to themselves quickly. He completed his circle, standing in front of me again. "You've been hiding in plain sight for how long?" 9 years. A murmur ran through the crowd at my admission. My family's space in the line had become a pocket of isolation, people backing away from them as if proximity to psykerkin might be contagious. 9 years, the psyker repeated. "And in all that time you never once used your abilities deliberately." "Once," I admitted. Just now, my sister was about to manifest in front of everyone. I absorbed her flare, dispersed it, saved her. "Your sister," the milky eyes turned toward where my family stood, "found Liana despite their blindness." "The young one." "I see." "How long has she been hiding?" I said nothing. There were some betrayals I wouldn't commit, even under these circumstances. The psyker seemed to understand. "It doesn't matter. I can sense it now that I know to look. She's suppressed too, though not as deeply as you. Recently manifested, I'd guess. 2, perhaps 3 years." Still, I said nothing. "Here is what will happen," the psyker continued, his voice still carrying that terrible gentleness. "You will be collected. You'll board the black ship, undergo full psychic evaluation on Terra, and likely be sanctioned given your demonstrated control. With proper training, you might even serve usefully in the Telepathica. And my family? Imperial law is clear. Harboring an unsanctioned psyker knowingly is grounds for execution of all family members. However," he paused, and I saw something that might have been pity cross his face. "However, there's an alternative. You tell me exactly when you manifested, who knew, who helped you hide. You give testimony that your family was ignorant of your true nature until this moment. And in exchange, I recommend leniency. Your family lives. It was a trap, of course, but a trap with only one correct answer. I manifested 9 years ago, I began. I never told anyone. I hid it completely. My family had no idea until your father trained you. The Psyker's voice remained gentle, but carried absolute certainty. I can read the shape of your suppression techniques. They're crude but effective, the kind of knowledge passed from fearful parent to cursed child. And your sister's pattern matches yours too closely to be coincidence. Someone taught you both the same methods. I closed my eyes. The attempt to save my family through lies had failed before it began. Of course it had. You couldn't lie to someone who could read the psychic echoes of truth in your mind. My father suspected what I was, I said, each word feeling like pulling teeth. He taught me to suppress it, to never use it, to stay hidden. He was trying to protect me. And the sister? Same. She manifested 2 years ago. We taught her together. The mother? Knew. Helped hide it. The brother? Innocent. He only found out 3 weeks ago. The Psyker nodded as if I'd confirmed something he'd already known. He turned to face my family, specifically my father, who stood with his shoulders squared and his face set in grim acceptance. You, the Psyker said, you knowingly harbored not 1 but 2 unsanctioned Psykers, trained them to hide from Imperial authorities, subverted the soul tithe. Do you understand the severity of these crimes? My father stepped forward, and I saw Kale try to hold him back. He shrugged off his youngest son's grip and walked until he stood beside where I knelt. I understand perfectly, he said. They're my children. What would you have had me do? Surrender them to be consumed by the Golden Throne? Watch them die to fuel the Emperor's existence? I couldn't. I wouldn't. So you committed heresy to save them. If loving my children is heresy, then yes, I'm a heretic. The courtyard had gone absolutely silent. Hundreds of people watching this drama unfold, likely relieved it was someone else's family being destroyed instead of their own. The Psyker looked at my father for a long moment, those blind eyes seeing things I couldn't imagine. Your honesty is admirable, if foolish. The law permits only 1 sentence for crimes such as yours. I know, my father said. He placed his hand on my shoulder. Take my son. Take my daughter. But let my wife and my other son live. They're guilty of nothing but being related to Psykers they couldn't control. Father, no. I started to rise, but the tithe hunters forced me back down. The law is not negotiable, the Psyker said. But his tone suggested something else. A hesitation. A crack in the absolute authority. However, the Imperium values service over punishment when possible. Here is my judgment. The 2 Psykers will be collected. The father, as their teacher and primary conspirator, will also be collected. What? The word burst from my mother. He's not a Psyker. You can't. I can take anyone I deem necessary for interrogation and processing, the Psyker interrupted. Your husband will accompany his children to Terra. There he'll be questioned extensively about his methods for hiding Psykers, any knowledge he possesses that might be useful to the Imperium. If he cooperates fully, he may earn a quick death rather than a prolonged one. And us? Kale asked. He'd stepped forward to stand beside my mother, one arm around her shoulders. My mother and me? You will live. The brother's ignorance is believable. He lacks the psychic sensitivity to have noticed what his siblings were. The mother, the Psyker's blind gaze turned to her. The mother's guilt is absolute, but I'm choosing pragmatism over justice. You've lost husband and 2 children. You'll return to your farm and live with that loss. If you speak of this incident, spread tales of imperial cruelty or injustice, I'll know. And I'll return. Do you understand? My mother, who had aged a lifetime in the span of minutes, nodded. She couldn't speak. Tears streamed down her face silently. "Take them to the holding area," the Psyker commanded. "All three. The Psykers require standard containment. The father gets standard restraints." The tithe hunters moved with practiced efficiency. Iron collars, sanctified, inscribed with prayers that I could feel burning against my psychic senses, were locked around Liana's neck and mine. My father received simple iron manacles on his wrists. We were marked, claimed, property of the Imperium. As they led us away, I looked back once, saw my mother collapsed against Kale, sobbing, saw the crowd already turning away, the spectacle over, returning to their own assessments and their own fears. Saw the sanctioned Psyker watching our family with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been nothing at all. Then we were through the fortress gates and into the holding area where dozens of other collected Psykers waited, and my old life ended forever. The holding area was exactly what you'd expect from a practical system designed to warehouse human souls awaiting transportation. A large stone building that had likely been a granary once, repurposed for this grim collection every 7 years. Straw on the floor, one corner designated for waste, guards at the single entrance. No windows, no light except what filtered in through gaps in the roof tiles. Liana and I were separated from my father immediately. Psykers went into the main holding area with other Psykers. Non-Psykers being collected for other reasons. Crimes, interrogation, transportation as slaves or servitors, went to a different section. I caught one last glimpse of my father being led away, his eyes finding mine across the crowded space, his lips forming words I couldn't hear but understood anyway. "I'm sorry. I love you." Then he was gone, and Liana and I were pushed into the mass of other collected Psykers. There were perhaps 60 of them. Us. 60 Psykers, ages ranging from what looked like 8 years old to mid-40s, all wearing the iron collars that marked us as claimed. Some were crying, some sat in muted shock. Some, the ones who'd been using their powers extensively before capture, who'd drawn deep from the warp, already showed physical signs of corruption. Fingers that bent at wrong angles, eyes that saw too much, skin that crawled with patterns that didn't quite qualify as witch marks, but suggested something worse. Liana pressed against my side, and I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. She was 14 years old, should have been worrying about courtship and harvest festivals, and learning to run a household. Instead, she was condemned to transportation to Terra, assessment by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, and a fate that would almost certainly end in death. "I'm sorry," I whispered to her. "I should have—" "Don't," she interrupted. Her voice was raw but steady. "Don't apologize for saving me. If you hadn't absorbed my flair, I would have manifested in front of everyone anyway. At least this way, I got to see Mother and Kale survive. Small mercy, better than none." We sat in silence for a while, backs against the cold stone wall. Around us the holding area filled with the sounds of human suffering, weeping prayers, whispered conversations. The occasional scream when someone's controls slipped and the guards had to intervene with sanctified rods that delivered psychically disruptive shocks. A boy, couldn't have been more than 10, sat near us, rocking back and forth with his hands pressed over his ears. "Too loud," he kept saying. "Everyone's too loud. Can't make them stop." "Telepath," Liana murmured to me. "Hearing everyone's thoughts. Must be agony in a space this crowded." She was right. I could feel it too, though less acutely. The iron collar suppressed active use of powers, but couldn't completely block psychic sensitivity. And with 60 Psykers crammed into one space, all of us radiating fear and despair, the psychic atmosphere was almost physically oppressive. It pressed against my mind like humid air, thick and suffocating. Hours passed. More Psykers arrived as the assessment continued. By evening, the holding area contained nearly 100 souls. They brought us food, grey nutrient paste that tasted like cardboard but filled the stomach. They brought us water. They even, to my surprise, brought us blankets as the night temperatures dropped. The Imperium was thorough, I realized. Efficient. These psykers represented valuable resources, potential psychic soldiers, astropaths, sacrifices for the Golden Throne. You didn't let valuable resources die from simple neglect before they could be processed. My father was somewhere in this building, but might as well have been on another planet for all the access we had to him. I wondered if he was scared. Probably. He'd spent 9 years fearing this outcome, and now it had arrived exactly as he'd dreaded. But I also thought he might be relieved. The waiting was over. The hiding had ended. Whatever came next, at least it would be honest. "Do you think they'll kill him quickly?" Liana asked, echoing my thoughts. The Psyker said if he cooperated. I don't know. I don't think they will, honestly. Father's knowledge, how to hide Psykers, how to suppress manifestation, that's probably valuable to the Imperium. Not for hiding more witches, but for understanding how to find them. They'll interrogate him extensively. Months, maybe years. That's worse than just killing him. Yes. Another silence stretched between us. In the darkness of the holding area, with only minimal light from a few flickering torches, I could barely see Liana's face. But I could feel her presence, the familiar psychic signature I'd become attuned to over the past 2 years of shared hiding. "I used to dream about this," she said eventually, "about being caught. In the dreams, I was always alone, being dragged onto the black ships by myself, with the family safe behind me. I thought that would be the worst thing, being taken away from everyone I loved. And now I realize being taken with them is worse, because I can't even pretend they're safe and happy without me. I know they're suffering too." I tightened my arm around her shoulders. "Father made his choice. He chose to protect us, knowing the cost. That's not your fault or mine." "Feels like it is, though." "Yes," I agreed. "It does." We spent 3 days in the holding area. 3 days of sitting on straw-covered floors, eating bland nutrient paste, listening to the sounds of other psykers slowly breaking down around us. The young telepath who'd been hearing everyone's thoughts went catatonic on the 2nd day. A woman in her 40s, a precognitive who'd hidden for decades before finally being caught, spent hours staring at nothing, occasionally whispering about futures that would never arrive. A boy around my age kept attempting to use his powers, despite the suppression collar, trying to move objects or create small flames, failing every time but unable to stop compulsively trying. Liana and I maintained our practiced control. After 9 years and 2 years, respectively, of constant suppression, it was second nature now. We existed in our muted states, feeling very little, expressing even less. Some of the other psykers noticed. They recognized the signs of long-term hiding and gave us a sort of grim respect. We were survivors, even if survival had only delayed our collection rather than prevented it. On the morning of the 4th day, the guards began organizing us for transport. They lined us up by categories I didn't fully understand: age, power level, something else. Liana and I were separated. She went into one group, I into another. We looked at each other across 10 feet of space that might as well have been an ocean. "I'll find you," I mouthed silently. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. And then we were being led out, different groups through different exits, and I lost sight of her in the crowd. My sister. The person I'd hidden beside for 2 years. The person I'd saved and doomed simultaneously. Gone. My group was marched through the fortress grounds and toward the landing fields where the black ships waited. 27 psykers in my group, ranging in age from 12 to early 30s. We walked in a shuffling line, iron collars marking us as witch cargo, guards on either side ensuring no one bolted. Not that running was an option. Where would we go? The entire planet knew what we were now. Any family who hid us would face execution. Any town that sheltered us would be purged. We were marked, claimed, belonging entirely to the Imperium now. The black ships were even more massive up close. I'd seen them from a distance, dark shapes blocking stars. But standing beneath them, Looking up at their armored hulls, I felt the true scale of the Imperium for the first time. These vessels were cities unto themselves, capable of crossing the vast gulfs between stars, carrying thousands of souls in their holds. They existed solely to collect Psykers from across the Imperium and transport them to Terra for processing. They were also prisons, floating torture chambers where unsanctioned Psykers were kept in conditions designed to break them completely before they even reached Terra. This was deliberate, I would learn. Better to break a Psyker during transport than have them break during assessment, where they might damage expensive equipment or kill valuable personnel. The ship's loading ramp descended with a pneumatic hiss. The interior beyond was darkness and the smell of recycled air, human waste, and something else, an acrid chemical scent I couldn't identify. As we approached the entrance, I heard screaming from somewhere deep inside the ship, not the scream of someone in immediate pain. The scream of someone who'd been screaming for so long it had become a continuous background noise, meaningless and endless. Welcome to your future, I thought. We were processed through the entrance in groups of 5. Standard procedure: remove all personal items. I had none. Examine collar integrity. Mine was solid. Assigned to holding cell. I was given a designation: 4. Gamma 19. That replaced my name for administrative purposes. Mikhail was gone. 4. Gamma 19 was all that remained. The cell was 3 meters by 2 meters. Metal walls, floor, ceiling. No windows, no furniture. A drain in one corner for waste. A dim lumen strip that provided just enough light to see by, but not enough to read, if there had been anything to read. The door was solid metal with a slot at the bottom for food delivery and a small grated window for guards to observe through. I was alone. Whatever cell Liana had been assigned to, it wasn't near mine. The door clanged shut. The lock engaged with a grinding sound that seemed to echo in my bones. And for the first time in 9 years of careful control, I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. I didn't cry. Crying would have been a release, and I'd forgotten how to release anything. Instead, I sat against the cold metal wall, drew my knees to my chest, and simply existed in the absolute misery of my situation. 9 years of hiding. 9 years of suppressing every emotion, denying every impulse, strangling my own humanity in service of survival. And it had all been for nothing. No, not nothing. Liana had gotten 2 extra years of life before being caught. My father had gotten to see both his witch children grow into adolescence and young adulthood, rather than being taken as children. My mother and Kale were alive, free, able to continue their lives even if those lives would be haunted by what they'd lost. It was something. A small, terrible something. But in the crushing darkness of my cell on a black ship, preparing for transit, even small somethings felt like wealth beyond measure. The ship departed Agathon's orbit 2 days later. I felt it through the walls. The rumble of massive engines igniting, the gradual build of acceleration, the slight vertigo of gravity systems engaging. We were leaving. My home planet, the world where I'd lived all 22 years of my life, was receding behind us at speeds I couldn't comprehend. I would never see it again. Food came twice daily through the slot. The same grey nutrient paste from the holding area, but now served cold and with a texture that suggested it had been partially recycled from previous meals. Water came once daily, a small cup that barely satisfied thirst. The lights never turned off completely, but dimmed to near darkness during what I assumed was sleep cycle. Time became meaningless. One day bled into the next with no variation, no markers to distinguish them. I tried keeping count at first, scratching marks into the metal wall with my fingernail, but gave up after what I thought was 2 weeks. What did it matter? Whether the journey to Terra took months or years, the outcome would be the same. The screaming continued constantly. Sometimes nearby, sometimes distant, always present. After a while I stopped hearing it as sound and started experiencing it as atmosphere. just another quality of the environment, like the chemical smell or the cold metal walls. Human suffering as background noise. Other times, I heard prayers, fellow Psykers crying out to the Emperor for mercy, protection, salvation. Their prayers echoed through ventilation shafts and between cells, creating a constant drone of desperate faith. I wondered if the Emperor heard them, wondered if he cared, wondered if a god who required Psyker souls as fuel to maintain his own existence was capable of mercy toward the very people he consumed. I didn't pray. What would be the point? The Emperor had made his choice regarding Psykers long ago. We were resources, fuel, tools to be used and discarded. Praying to him for relief was like praying to a fire not to burn you while you were being thrown into it as kindling. Months passed. I thought months anyway. The journey to Terra was supposed to take anywhere from 3 months to a year, depending on warp currents, route, and how many other worlds the ship collected from before making the final transit to the throne world. This ship, whatever its designation was, seemed to be taking the longer route. My cell door opened 3 times during the journey. The first time was for medical examination. Robed adepts, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks, entered with scanning equipment and made various notes about my physical condition. They didn't speak to me, didn't acknowledge me as a person. I was cargo being assessed for delivery condition. The exam took perhaps 10 minutes, then they left. The second time was for what I later understood to be a psychic stress test. A sanctioned psyker, not the same one who'd collected me but similar, with that same milky-eyed blindness and aura of controlled power, entered my cell and simply pushed. Psychic pressure directed at my mind, testing my barriers, measuring my resistance. The iron collar prevented me from pushing back, but it didn't protect me from the assault. It hurt, not physically, but somewhere deeper. Like having fingers prying at the edges of my consciousness, trying to crack me open and see what spilled out. I endured it. What choice did I have? After 30 minutes, an eternity of pressure and intrusion, the psyker left. I huddled in the corner of my cell for what felt like hours afterward, shaking from the psychic equivalent of shock. The third time the door opened, my father was pushed inside. I didn't recognize him at first. The man who entered my cell had my father's height and general build, but his face had aged 20 years in what I thought was 3 or 4 months. His hair had gone completely white. Deep lines carved his face into a geography of suffering. His eyes, once sharp and alert, had gone distant, seeing things that existed only in memory or nightmare. "Father," my voice cracked from disuse. He looked at me, and recognition slowly filtered into his expression. "Mikhail, is that? They said you were here, but I didn't." We embraced in the middle of the cell, 2 condemned men finding brief comfort in familiar presence. He felt fragile in my arms, as if he'd lost significant weight. His clothes, the same rough-spun work clothes he'd been wearing when collected, hung loose on his frame. "What did they do to you?" I asked. "Interrogated me." His voice was a rasp, suggesting damage to his throat. "Extensively. They wanted to know everything. How I recognized your manifestation, how I taught you to suppress, what signs to look for in other hidden psykers. They were thorough." "Did you tell them everything?" "They have methods. Psychic interrogators who can pull memories directly from your mind, rearrange your thoughts, make you relive your worst moments until you do anything, say anything, to make it stop." He pulled back from the embrace, slumped against the wall. "I told them everything, Mikhail. Every technique, every warning sign, every method I'd cobbled together to hide you. And in return, they gave me this." He gestured to the cell we shared. "This, a few hours with you before," he stopped. "Started again. They're moving me to the forward section, the area where they keep people designated for immediate processing upon arrival at Terra, which is a polite way of saying immediate execution. No. The word was automatic, meaningless. They said if you cooperated, they lied. Or I misunderstood. Or it doesn't matter. My father managed a weak smile. The Imperium got what it wanted from me. Now I'm excess to requirements. We sat in silence. There was so much I wanted to say. Apologies, expressions of love, questions about whether he regretted his choices. But the words stuck in my throat, meaningless in the face of absolute tragedy. I saw Liana, my father said eventually. Briefly, during my transport through the holding sections. She's surviving. Looks healthier than many of the others. I think her shorter time hiding means her psychic profile is less suppressed, which ironically might help her during assessment. They want psykers who can be trained and used, not just consumed. Did you speak to her? No, they don't allow communication. But she saw me. We looked at each other for a few seconds. His voice broke. She's so young, Mikhail. 14 years old. Should be learning to weave and cook and prepare for marriage. Instead, she's cargo on a black ship heading toward a fate neither of us can imagine. It's not your fault, isn't it? I taught you to hide. If I'd turned you in immediately when you manifested, you'd have been taken at 13. 9 fewer years of life, but also 9 years less trauma, 9 years less living in constant fear. Maybe that would have been more merciful. You gave me 9 years, I said. 9 years of seeing seasons change, of watching Kale grow up, of eating mother's cooking and sleeping in my own bed, and feeling sunlight on my face. Yes, they were years of fear, but they were also years of life. I'm grateful for them. My father looked at me with eyes swimming in tears. You're a better man than I am. I'm your son. That makes me exactly the man you made me. We talked for what felt like hours but was probably less. About the farm, about the family, about memories from before the curse had awakened in me. My father told me about the interrogations in more detail. The psychic intrusion, the memory extraction, the way they'd mapped his knowledge and then discarded him like used parchment. I told him about the journey, about the screaming and the isolation and the slow erosion of hope that came with understanding how absolutely we were owned by the Imperium. Eventually, the cell door opened. Guards stood outside, gesturing for my father to rise. "Time's up," one said. My father stood slowly, joints creaking. He looked down at me one last time. "Whatever happens to you on Terra," he said, "whatever they do to you or make you do, survive it. Use that control I taught you. Find Liana if you can. Take care of each other. I will, and know that I loved you, always. Even when I was teaching you to hide what you were, even when I was terrified of what you might become, I loved you. I know. I love you too." He walked to the door, paused at the threshold, looked back. "The Emperor protects," he said, and the irony in his voice was thick enough to cut. "The Emperor protects," I echoed. And then he was gone, led away to whatever fate awaited him in the forward sections. I never saw him again. The rest of the journey passed in a fog of numbness so complete I barely remember it. Time happened. I existed. Food came, was eaten, passed through my system. Sleep came, brought nightmares, departed. The screaming continued. The prayers continued. The ship hurtled through the warp toward Terra. I thought about my father during those endless days. Wondered when they would kill him. Wondered if it had already happened. Wondered if he'd been given any mercy, or if his execution had been as brutal as everything else the Imperium did to people like us. I thought about Liana. Hoped she was surviving. Hoped the assessment would determine she was valuable enough to train rather than consume. Hoped she would find some way to endure in a system designed to grind people like us into paste. I thought about my mother and Kale, back on Agathon. They would have returned to the farm, would be working the fields, maintaining the house, continuing life as if half the family hadn't been ripped away. Were they grieving? Probably. Were they also relieved that the constant fear had ended? Maybe. Survival required both grief and relief in equal measure. I thought about myself, which was the most dangerous direction my thoughts could turn. What would happen during my assessment? I was 22, old for an unsanctioned psyker. I'd hidden successfully for 9 years, demonstrating unusual control. Did that make me valuable for training, or did it make me suspect as potentially corrupted? I'd used my power exactly once in 9 years, to save Liana. Was that a sign of disciplined control or dangerous attachment? I had no answers. The Imperium would make its judgment, and I would live or die accordingly. Terror appeared in the view screens they occasionally activated to show us our destination. A world that had once been green and blue, now covered in cityscapes so extensive it wrapped the entire planet. Buildings reached into the atmosphere. Industry churned without pause. And somewhere in the heart of that impossible urban sprawl, the Golden Throne sat, with the Emperor himself bound to it, consuming psyker souls by the thousands to maintain his existence and power. We were heading toward the mouth that would devour us. The ship entered orbit, docked with a massive station that processed incoming black ships. My cell door opened, and guards herded me, along with dozens of other psykers from adjacent cells, through corridors toward debarkation. I looked for Liana among the crowds, but didn't see her. Different processing groups, probably. Different timelines. Terror's air tasted of metal and chemicals. The station interior was all harsh lumens and austere military efficiency. Robed adepts moved among us, scanning collars, reading designations, directing psykers into various queues based on criteria I didn't understand. 4 Gamma 19, an adept called reading my designation. Preliminary category, potential sanctioned service. Forward for assessment, potential sanctioned service. That meant I wasn't marked for immediate consumption. It meant I had a chance, however slim, at survival beyond the next few weeks. It also meant training, indoctrination, breaking, and rebuilding into something useful for the Imperium. It meant losing whatever remained of my identity. It meant service that would likely last decades or centuries, my psychic abilities harnessed and controlled by the very system that had hunted me. But it meant survival. I was herded onto a transport vehicle with 30 other psykers, all around my age, all marked for assessment rather than immediate processing. As we lifted off toward the assessment facilities deeper in Terra's urban labyrinth, I caught one final glimpse of the black ship we'd arrived on. Already it was being cleaned and resupplied, preparing for another circuit, another collection, another cargo of souls for the Imperium's eternal hunger. The machine continued. It always continued, and we were all just fuel for its operation. The Scholastica Psychana complex was a fortress within a fortress, buried deep beneath Terra's surface where the weight of billions pressed down from above. Miles of stone and steel separated us from natural light, from weather, from any reminder that we were on a planet rather than imprisoned in some liminal space between real and unreal. The assessment process took weeks, maybe months. Time became even more abstract than it had been on the black ship, marked only by the succession of tests, evaluations, and indoctrinations they subjected us to. First came the psychic evaluation, a series of tests designed to measure our power level, our discipline, our potential for corruption. Sanctioned psykers with decades of training pushed at our minds, tested our barriers, made us perform specific tasks under controlled conditions. I demonstrated my telekinesis, the ability that had first manifested 9 years ago. I showed them how I could sense emotions from nearby people. I displayed my capacity for psychic suppression, the control I'd developed through years of hiding. They were impressed. Unusual discipline for an unsanctioned, one evaluator noted in my file. Subject demonstrates suppression techniques typically seen only in formally trained adepts, likely result of extensive self-teaching or informal instruction. Recommend full assessment for potential astropathic service. Astropath. psychic communicators who enabled faster-than-light communication across the Imperium. It was considered one of the more prestigious assignments for a sanctioned psyker, though prestigious was relative when all options involved having your psychic abilities permanently bound and controlled by the Imperium's methods. Next came the loyalty indoctrination, hours, days, of sermons about the Emperor's divinity, humanity's manifest destiny, the necessity of sacrifice in service to the species. They showed us vid feeds of worlds destroyed by unsanctioned psykers who'd been possessed by demons, of the horrors that lurked in the warp, waiting for unprotected minds to invade. They taught us the litany of protection, the prayer of binding, the hymn of the eternal vigil. They made us recite these prayers until the words lost meaning and became simply sounds, muscle memory of the tongue and throat. I participated, recited when commanded, demonstrated appropriate reverence during religious instruction. I'd spent 9 years hiding my nature. Hiding my thoughts during indoctrination was barely more difficult. But I noticed things. Noticed how the prayers were designed to create psychological dependency, making us believe we couldn't control our powers without imperial guidance. Noticed how the horror stories about corruption were real, but also used as fear tools to ensure compliance. Noticed how they were breaking us down psychologically to rebuild us as loyal servants. It was efficient, effective, and almost impossible to resist. Midway through my assessment, I saw Liana again. She was in a different processing group, undergoing evaluations similar to mine but on a different timeline. Our paths crossed in one of the rare communal areas, a large chamber where multiple assessment groups ate together under heavy supervision. Our eyes met across 100 feet of crowded space. She'd changed. The soft curves of adolescence had sharpened into something harder. Her eyes had developed the same haunted quality mine carried, but she was alive, surviving. I tried to approach her, made it perhaps 20 feet before a guard intercepted me. No communication between processing groups, he stated flatly. She's my sister. You have no sister. You're 4, Gamma 19. She's 7, Delta 04. You're processing categories, not family. I looked past him at Liana. She'd stopped walking, standing frozen in the crowd. People flowed around her like water around stone. We looked at each other, siblings connected by shared trauma and shared blood, and I tried to communicate everything I felt in that single look. I'm here. I see you. We're surviving. She nodded once, tears streaming down her face. Then her group was herded toward a different exit, and she was gone again. That brief glimpse sustained me through the next phase of assessment, the binding. The binding was the process by which unsanctioned psykers were transformed into sanctioned ones. It involved psychic techniques I didn't understand, possibly augmented with technology or chemicals, designed to place permanent restrictions on our abilities. After binding, we would still be psykers, but would be unable to draw deeply from the warp without imperial authorization and supervision. We would be controlled, leashed, safe for service. The binding hurt. I can't adequately describe the sensation because human language lacks the vocabulary. It wasn't physical pain, though my body certainly reacted, screaming, convulsing, every muscle locked tight. It wasn't exactly mental pain either, though my mind felt like it was being rearranged from the inside. It was a soul-deep agony, the sensation of having something fundamental about your existence altered without consent. When it was over, I lay on the stone floor of the binding chamber, unable to move, aware that something had changed permanently inside me. The power was still there. I could feel it coiled in the back of my mind. But now there were walls, channels, structures that hadn't existed before, directing and limiting how I could access that power. Binding successful, a voice stated clinically. Subject 4. Gamma 19 now designated sanctioned Psyker Mikhail Venn, assigned to astropathic training program. Mikhail Venn. They'd given me back my name, or part of it. Mikhail Venn of nowhere, son of no one, belonging entirely to the Scholastica Psykana, and through them to the Imperium. The farm on Agathon, the family I'd known, the life I'd lived, all of it erased. I was newborn into service. The training began immediately. They taught us to use our powers in approved ways, channeling psychic energy through sanctified techniques that minimized warp corruption risk. They taught us the astropathic disciplines, how to project thoughts across the warp, how to receive messages from other astropaths, how to translate psychic impressions into actionable intelligence. They taught us the prayers and rituals that would protect us during transmission, the proper forms to use when communicating Imperial commands. It was grueling. Hours of practice daily, pushing our bound powers to their limits, learning to operate within the new restrictions the binding had imposed. Many Psykers failed during training, their discipline insufficient, their powers too weak or too wild, their minds unable to withstand the stress of constant warp exposure, even through protected channels. Failures were taken away. We never learned what happened to them, but we could guess. The Golden Throne was always hungry. I succeeded. 9 years of constant suppression had taught me discipline that most Psykers never developed. The careful control my father had taught me translated well into the astropathic techniques. Within what I think was 6 months, I'd achieved basic certification. Within a year, I was considered competent for field assignment. During that year of training, I saw Liana exactly twice more. The first time was during an astropathic practice session. My training group was learning to receive long-distance transmissions, sitting in meditation while an instructor sent psychic messages from across the complex. And suddenly, cutting through the instructor's signal, I felt a familiar presence. Liana. She was somewhere in the complex, possibly in a similar training session, and our powers had briefly touched across whatever distance separated us. No words. Just a moment of recognition, the psychic equivalent of seeing each other across a crowded room. Then the instructor's signal strengthened, drowning out the connection, and she was gone. The second time was more deliberate. I'd been assigned to a work detail maintaining astropathic relay equipment, grunt work that sanctioned Psykers often performed between training sessions. Liana was part of another work detail in the same area, maintaining different equipment. We worked 30 feet apart for 4 hours. Never spoke, barely looked at each other. But we were present together, siblings laboring in service to the same horrific system that had destroyed our family. There was grim comfort in that proximity. Near the end of the work shift, when the overseers were distracted by a malfunction in another section, Liana moved closer to me. She pretended to examine equipment near where I worked. We were perhaps 5 feet apart, close enough to whisper. "Are you all right?" she asked, voice barely audible. "Surviving," I answered. "You?" "Same. They're training me for telepathic service. Communications specialist." "Good. That's a long-term assignment. Means they think you're worth keeping." "Father?" "Dead, probably. He said they were moving him to immediate processing." I had to think. Time was so uncertain. "Months ago. On the ship." "I thought so. I tried to sense him, but..." She made a small gesture that encompassed the impossibility of finding one specific person among millions on Terra, especially if that person was already dead. "Mother and Kale are alive at least," I offered. "Yes, I try not to think about them. It hurts too much." We stood in silence for a moment, 2 siblings who'd once shared a home and a family and a terrible secret, now reduced to stolen moments in a massive facility designed to turn them into tools. "I should go back to my station," Liana said, "before someone notices." "Wait," I had to ask. "Do you regret it?" "Manifesting at the festival. If you could go back, would you try harder to suppress it?" She thought about it. "No," she said eventually. "I was 12. The power was too new, too strong. I couldn't have stopped it any more than you could have stopped yours at 13. This was always going to happen. Maybe not exactly like this, but something similar. The curse finds us all eventually. That's a bleak way to look at it. We serve the Imperium on a world that consumes Psykers for fuel. Bleakness is accuracy. She turned to go, then looked back once more. Stay alive, Mikhail. That's the only rebellion available to us. My field assignment came suddenly, as these things apparently did. One morning I was summoned from my dormitory. Yes, they'd given us dormitories rather than cells, a small upgrade in living conditions, and informed I was being deployed to an astropathic relay station designated as Station Tertius 4-4, located on a frontier world called Varsavia. You'll serve minimum 10-year posting, the assignment officer informed me, renewable based on performance and psychic stability. You'll be part of a 5-psyker team maintaining communications for the local sector. Standard isolation protocols apply. Questions. I had 1,000 questions. I asked none of them. No, sir. Report to Launch Bay 7 in 4 hours. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. I was 23 years old, had been a sanctioned psyker for approximately 1 year, and was being sent halfway across the galaxy to spend the next decade channeling messages through the warp. It was, in its own horrifying way, an honor. Most sanctioned psykers never left Terra, spending their entire service lives in the complex's relay stations, or eventually being consumed by the Golden Throne when their powers degraded too far. I was getting out, seeing other worlds. It should have felt like freedom. It felt like exile. I had 4 hours to prepare for departure. I owned nothing except the robes I wore, standard issue for sanctioned psykers, so preparation was mostly mental. Saying goodbye to the place where I'd been broken and rebuilt, acknowledging that the Mikhail who'd hidden on Agathon for 9 years was truly dead now, replaced by sanctioned psyker Mikhail Venn, astropathic relay specialist. I spent one of those hours trying to find Liana, went to the sections where telepathic training occurred, asked cautious questions of people who might know her schedule. It was risky. Sanctioned psykers weren't forbidden from contacting each other, but we were discouraged from forming attachments. Attachments were inefficiencies. The Imperium wanted loyal servants, not people with emotional connections that might complicate orders. I never found her. Either she was in a session I couldn't access, or someone deliberately prevented me from locating her, or pure chance worked against me. Regardless, when my 4 hours expired and I reported to Launch Bay 7, I did so without saying goodbye to my sister. It would be 17 years before I saw her again. Station Tertius 4-4 was exactly as advertised, a frontier relay station on a world that existed primarily as a logistics hub for nearby military operations. The station itself was a fortified structure housing 5 sanctioned psykers, a staff of 23 support personnel, and enough defensive equipment to withstand a light siege. My 4 colleagues were all veterans, having served anywhere from 3 to 15 years already. They greeted me with professional courtesy and no warmth. I didn't blame them. Attachments were liabilities. They'd probably seen new assignments come and go, some lasting years, some breaking within months. No point getting close to someone who might not survive long. The work was exactly what I'd been trained for, sitting in a shielded chamber, opening my psychically bound mind to the warp in carefully controlled ways, receiving messages from other astropaths across the sector, translating those messages into usable intelligence, and transmitting outgoing communications from the station's commanders. 8-hour shifts, 6 days out of 7 for 10 years minimum. It was monotonous. It was exhausting. It was life. The warp was not what I'd expected. During training, they described it as a dimension of pure psychic energy, chaotic and dangerous, but navigable with proper techniques. They'd been underselling the horror. The warp wasn't just chaotic, it was malevolent. Every time I opened my mind to receive or transmit, I felt things at the edges of my consciousness, presences, entities, things that noticed the small crack I'd created in reality and wanted to push through, to use me as a doorway into the material universe. The binding and the prayers kept them at bay. Mostly. But I could feel them constantly, pressing, testing, looking for weakness. It was like being in a sealed room and knowing there were predators on the other side of every wall, waiting for the seal to break. My colleagues were matter-of-fact about this. "You get used to it," one told me during a rare social moment. "Eventually you stop noticing the things at the edges. They're just background noise." I never stopped noticing. Every transmission was a battle to maintain focus, ignore the whispers, complete the task without letting anything through. After 8-hour shifts, I would stumble back to my quarters, a small room with a bed, a desk, and nothing else, and sleep for 12 hours, dreams filled with half-glimpsed horrors my mind had brushed against during work. Years passed. 1 year, 3 years, 5. The work continued. Messages received, translated, transmitted. Military orders, logistical data, administrative directives. The vast machinery of the Imperium communicating with itself, and I was one small node in that network. I changed during those years, not dramatically. The binding prevented the kind of warp corruption that twisted Psykers into monsters, but subtly. My hair began graying prematurely. My eyes developed a permanent squint, as if I was always looking at something bright. I lost weight despite adequate food, my body burning energy to sustain constant psychic activity. I stopped dreaming about anything except the warp. In my 8th year at the station, one of my colleagues, a woman named Thessia who'd served for 14 years, simply stopped coming to her shift. We found her in her quarters, sitting on her bed, staring at nothing. When we tried to communicate with her, she didn't respond, just stared with eyes that saw nothing in the material world. "Psychic degradation," the station commander diagnosed. "Her mind's been worn too thin by constant warp exposure. She's gone catatonic." "Can she recover?" I asked. "No, she'll be shipped back to Terra for final processing." Final processing. Consumption by the Golden Throne. After 14 years of loyal service, Thessia's reward was to have her psychic essence drained to sustain the Emperor's existence. They replaced her within a month. A young man fresh from training, wide-eyed and terrified and convinced this assignment was an honor. I remembered being like him once. The memory felt centuries old. My 10-year minimum posting ended. I was offered renewal, standard procedure for psychers who hadn't degraded too severely. I accepted. What was the alternative? Refusal likely meant return to Terra for reassignment, which could mean anything from training new recruits to being fed to the Golden Throne. At least here I had a function, a role, a reason to continue existing. 5 more years. 15 total. I was 38 years old and looked 50. 2 more colleagues degraded during that period and were shipped out for final processing. We received replacements. The work continued. And then, during a routine transmission, I felt something familiar. A psychic signature I recognized. Not at the edges where the daemons pressed, but in the message stream itself. Another astropath communicating across vast distances, and their mental fingerprint was achingly familiar despite the years and training that had shaped it. Liana. I couldn't respond directly. The protocols didn't allow personal communication, but I could feel her presence in the transmission network. She was alive, still serving, still surviving. It was enough. More than enough. I served 7 more years at Station Tertius, 4-4 before finally being rotated back to Terra. 22 years total at the frontier post. I was 45 years old. My hair was completely white. My hands had developed a constant tremor from psychic stress. My eyes were nearly colorless, bleached by years of warp gazing. They assessed me immediately upon return. Standard procedure for long-term field assignments. The evaluation determined I was still functional but showing significant degradation. Estimate: 5 to 8 more years of effective service before final processing. They assigned me to training duty, teaching new psychers the astropathic techniques I'd spent 2 decades practicing. It was considered light duty, a way to extract a few more years of value from a degrading asset before final consumption. I taught for 3 years. Saw hundreds of young psykers come through the program, most of them still carrying hope that somehow their service would be meaningful. I taught them the techniques, the prayers, the disciplines that would keep them alive a little longer. I didn't tell them about the inevitable degradation, the way constant warp exposure wore your mind to nothing, the fact that every year of service brought you closer to being fuel for the Golden Throne. They'd learn soon enough. During my 3rd year of training duty, I was supervising a practice session when an instructor from another department approached me. Sanctioned Psyker Mikhail Venn. Yes, you're wanted in conference room 7. There's someone asking for you specifically. I couldn't imagine who would ask for me. Most people I'd known were dead or scattered across the galaxy, but I went, leaving my training group under assistant supervision. The conference room was small, designed for private meetings. When I entered, there was someone already there, a woman in the robes of a sanctioned telepath. She turned as the door closed, and despite the changes the Imperium had carved into both of us, I knew her immediately. Ziana. She'd grown into a woman, my little sister. She was 31 years old, would have been beautiful in another life, but the service had marked her the same way it had marked me. Premature aging, colorless eyes, the subtle wrongness that came from spending years channeling psychic energy under constant stress. We stood looking at each other across 10 feet of empty room. "I heard you'd been rotated back to Terra," she said. "I requested this meeting." Wasn't sure they'd approve it, but apparently after 20+ years of loyal service, they're willing to grant small favors. "How long do we have?" 10 minutes. 10 minutes to encompass everything we'd endured, everything we'd lost, everything we'd become. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was more than many families received. We sat, not touching. Even now, after everything, we maintained the careful emotional distance we'd learned during our hiding years. Attachments were dangerous. Emotions fed powers. Control was survival. "You look terrible," Liana said with a small smile. "You look worse." "Liar." The smile faded. "They're rotating me to Terra permanently." Telepathic degradation. "I've got maybe 3 years left before I'm processed." "Same," I admitted. 5 to 8 for me. They're squeezing the last value out of us before final consumption. A reward for loyal service. The Emperor protects. We sat in silence. There should have been tears, rage, expressions of grief for the lives stolen from us. But we'd spent so long suppressing emotions that even now, facing the certain knowledge of our impending deaths, we could only manage this muted acknowledgement. "Do you remember the farm?" Liana asked eventually. "I try sometimes, but the memories feel like they belong to someone else. I remember it existed. Can't picture details anymore. Mother's face is gone, father's too. I remember Kale's name, but not what he looked like. The Imperium took everything. Even our memories." Yes, another silence, the minutes ticking away. "Was it worth it?" Liana asked. "Hiding? Fighting? All those years trying to avoid this?" I thought about it. Really considered the question. "We got extra time," I said finally. "You got 2 years, I got 9. Father got to watch us grow a little longer. Mother and Kale survived. Compared to being caught immediately, taken as children, consumed as children, yes, I think it was worth it. Even knowing it ended here anyway? Even knowing that?" Liana nodded. "I think so too. Sometimes. Other times, I'm not sure." A chime sounded. 5 minutes remaining. "They're going to consume us," I said, stating the obvious. "Within a few years, we'll both be fed to the Golden Throne. Burned up as fuel for the Emperor's existence. And no one will remember we existed, except maybe Kale and Mother, if they're even still alive. Probably they are. Normal humans on feudal worlds live reasonable lifespans. Kale would be, she calculated, 47. Mother would be 72. They're likely alive. Do you think they remember us? I hope not. Remembering would only hurt them. Another chime. 2 minutes. We stood simultaneously, some unspoken agreement that we should be on our feet for the end of this meeting. I don't want to die, Liana said suddenly. Her voice cracked, the first genuine emotion I'd heard from her in 17 years. I know it's coming. I know there's no escape. But I'm 31 years old, and I don't want to be consumed by some half-dead god emperor to fuel a system I never asked to be part of. I know. I took her hands, the first physical contact we'd shared since being taken from Agathon. Her hands were cold, trembling. But we don't get a choice. We never did. No, we never did. Final chime. Time expired. The door opened. A guard stood waiting to escort Liana back to her assignment. "Mikhail," she said, still holding my hands. "Thank you for absorbing my flare that day, for trying to save me, even though it didn't work, even though we both ended up here. Thank you for trying. Stay alive as long as you can," I told her. "That's all we can do. The only rebellion available to us." The only rebellion available to us. She released my hands, turned, walked through the door. The guard fell into step beside her. I watched them walk down the corridor until they turned a corner and disappeared. I never saw my sister again. 3 more years passed. I continued training new Psykers, teaching them techniques that would keep them functional a little longer before the inevitable degradation. I noticed the tremor in my hands worsening. Noticed my ability to focus during transmissions declining. Noticed the things at the edges of the warp getting closer, my defenses wearing thin. They noticed too, of course. The regular assessments tracked my decline with clinical precision. When my degradation reached critical thresholds, they issued the final assignment. Report to the Golden Throne Complex. Final processing in 3 days. I was 48 years old. Had been a Psyker for 35 years, 22 hidden, 13 sanctioned. Had served the Imperium loyally despite being given no choice in the matter. And now my service was complete. They gave me 2 days of personal time before processing. Standard procedure, apparently. A last gesture of mercy before consumption. I spent those days walking through sections of terror I'd never been allowed to visit. Saw the vast cityscape, the impossible scale of human civilization compressed into one planet. Saw billions of people living their lives, most of them unaware that the light and heat keeping them alive was powered partly by Psykers like me being consumed in the Emperor's throne. On the final day, I tried to find information about Liana. Asked discreet questions of administrators who might have access to processing records. Took risks I normally wouldn't, knowing that consequences didn't matter anymore. I found her name in the final processing logs. Sanctioned telepath Liana Venn. Processed 6 months earlier. Psychic essence consumed. Service record 14 years classified as exemplary. My little sister was dead. Had been dead for months while I'd continued teaching, unaware. The Imperium had consumed her, taken everything she was and burned it as fuel, and hadn't even bothered to inform me. The Emperor protects, they said. But he'd protected nothing. He'd taken a 12-year-old girl, twisted her into a tool, used her until she broke, and then consumed her remains. I felt nothing, not rage, not grief, not even the numb acknowledgement that had characterized our reunion. I felt nothing because I'd forgotten how to feel anything beyond the muted existence required for survival. And now, even survival was ending. The 3rd day arrived. I reported to the Golden Throne Complex as ordered. The inner chambers, where the processing actually occurred, were off-limits even to sanctioned Psykers. I knew only that I'd be led into certain areas, exposed to the Emperor's psychic presence, and my essence would be drawn out and consumed. The physical body might survive for a while, catatonic, empty, but everything that made me Mikhail would be gone. They led me through security checkpoints, past guard stations manned by Adeptus Custodes, whose mere presence radiated threat, through corridors carved from ancient stone, through chambers that hummed with psychic energy so intense it made my degraded barriers ache, and then into the final chamber. The Emperor was there, not physically, his physical form remained bound to the golden throne in another section, but his psychic presence filled the chamber like water filling a cup. It was immense, ancient, inhuman. Whatever the Emperor had been 10,000 years ago, he wasn't that anymore. He was hunger, purpose without consciousness, a perpetual motion machine of psychic consumption that sustained itself by devouring souls. I felt his presence touch my mind, felt the pull beginning. In those final moments, with my consciousness starting to dissolve, I thought about my family, about my mother, who might still be alive on Agathon, who'd lost her husband and 2 children to the Imperium's hunger, about Kale, who'd been innocent of everything except being related to Psykers, about my father, who'd fought so hard to save his children and had died in the attempt, about Liana, who'd been consumed 6 months earlier, her essence now part of whatever sustained the Emperor's existence. About myself, the boy who'd moved a cup at 13 and changed everything, who'd spent 9 years hiding, 13 years serving, and was now ending as fuel for a god machine that cared nothing for the individuals it consumed. There should have been meaning in this, purpose, some narrative structure that made the suffering worthwhile. But there was none. Just consumption. Just the machine grinding forward, using people as components, discarding them when they broke, replacing them with new victims. The pull strengthened. My consciousness fragmented. I felt myself dissolving, awareness spreading and dissipating like ink in water. My final thought, before everything ended, was simple. We tried. We hid. We fought. We survived longer than we should have. We found moments of humanity in a system designed to erase humanity. We loved each other despite being taught that love was weakness. We remembered who we'd been, even as the Imperium tried to make us forget. We tried. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. But we tried. On Agathon, in a farmhouse that had stood for generations, an old woman sat by a small fire and remembered. Her husband had been dead for 31 years. Her daughter had been taken 31 years ago. Her eldest son had been taken the same day. Only her youngest, now a man of 47 with children of his own, remained. But she remembered them. Every day, despite the Imperium's warning that speaking of collected Psykers was dangerous, she remembered them. Mikhail with his serious face, Liana with her bright laugh, her husband whose name she whispered only in the dark hours before dawn. She didn't know they were dead, couldn't know, but she felt it, the way mothers sometimes feel these things, that they were gone not just from her life, but from life entirely, consumed by the system they'd tried so desperately to hide from. "What are you thinking about, Mother?" her son asked, entering the room with an armload of firewood. "Old memories," she said. Which was truth enough. You should rest. The harvest begins tomorrow. I know. She turned from the fire, looked at her son, her only remaining child, and managed a smile. "The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects," he echoed automatically, the words as natural as breathing after a lifetime of repetition. And in the darkness of the farmhouse, where 3 members of the family had once hidden a terrible secret, the fire burned low, and the woman remembered. Remembered because remembering was the only rebellion available to her. Because if someone didn't remember, if someone didn't hold on to the names and faces of those the Imperium had consumed, then they'd never existed at all, she remembered. And somewhere in the golden light that sustained an empire, in the psychic energies that powered a god emperor's existence, perhaps a tiny fragment of consciousness that had once been Mikhail Venn, that had once moved a cup at age 13 and doomed a family, perhaps that fragment remembered too. The Imperium protects, the machine continues, the cost is paid, always. Forever. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only this: service, consumption, and the fading memory of lives that tried to mean something in a universe that assigned them meaning only as fuel. This is what daily life was really like on a feudal world, that tithed Psykers. This is the price of humanity's survival. This is the Imperium the Emperor protects. But from his protection, there is no escape.